Hey everybody, how's it going? Hopefully you guys are doing well. Welcome back. Got a few minutes till class time. It's about, come on Peachy. Just trying to walk on the keyboard. About 4 minutes till class time. As you can see, Princess Peach is really getting involved in the meeting tonight, at least at the beginning. Come on Peach. She doesn't like me to not pay full attention to her, so this is what happens. Come on, girl. Peach. Yeah, she's a good kitty. Oh, sorry to hear that. But not to worry, all these lectures are permanently archived to the channel, and you'll always be able to watch them later if they're a little bit spotty in the first live viewing. But yeah, we're just doing our best. Appreciate it though. Thank you. Hi Dewey. Hi everybody else. Actually, this is Peachy. This is Eddie's sister. Maybe if I just hold her like this, she'll be all right. Hi there. Oh, yeah. Hello, hello. What you want, Peachy? No. Hello. Thank you guys for being here this evening. I'll be right with you guys to get our lecture rolling in a couple minutes. But yeah, welcome. Feel free to say hi. Anybody can tap into the chat and just say a couple words of hello if you want. Peachy. Hello. Peach. Hi. Peachy. Thanks, everybody. Just another minute or so, and then I'll get us going. Maybe I'll quickly send a little announcement to the class just so that everyone's aware of the change. I'm just going to try and make sure everybody's got the message. So I've got another window open. Give me 1 second. Okay. Cool. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. All right. So it's just now 5:30. Feel free to say hi and let me know that you're here. I appreciate you guys' attendance as always. But welcome back. So yeah, today we're going to continue going through this first topic of our course. We have some more stuff to talk about having to do with the philosophy of religion. Good to see all you guys. Thanks so much. I'll start off today with just a review of the major arguments and concepts that we went through last time. And then I have 2 new arguments about God's existence to go through with you guys today. So, looking at my syllabus to make sure I review everything from last time. Yeah, so last time was like objection day to Anselm. So let's just kind of go past the objections and the argument itself one more time. And then we're actually going to move on now to another argument. for God's existence. So closing the door for the time being on the whole ontological argument. All right, so this is a philosophy class, and we're starting by sampling the topic of philosophy of religion. In the philosophy of religion, we examine and consider arguments that have been given for the existence of God and whatever criticisms there have been against some of those arguments, just so that we can consider the back and forth and come to a rational point of view of our own. Now, there are many collected arguments throughout history that attempt to prove the existence of God. One of them that we learned about, that we started with, is called the Ontological Argument, which was written about 1,000 years ago by St. Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, so in 1077, he wrote the book Proslogion, and within the book, he outlines the argument called the Ontological Argument. So that argument tries to prove the existence of God. It has a sort of interesting approach about how it does that, or how it tries to do that. So to begin, he says, Anselm, the author, what kind of being is God believed to be? What type of being is God believed to be? And as he sees it, and he thinks this is something that everybody knows and can understand, God is thought of as the greatest conceivable being, the being than which none greater can be conceived. So the traditional aspects or attributes of God are things like omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all-good, omnipresent, all-present. So if you think about those qualities and you sum them up, they amount to a being that is greater than anything else. So the greatest conceivable being, the greatest being you could think of at all. And he says that's a definition and a concept that everyone does understand. It doesn't take a theist to know what the meaning of the word God is. An atheist doesn't say, I don't even know what you mean when they hear the word spoken. They understand that it refers to the idea of the greatest conceivable being. So atheists and theists alike have the idea of God in their mind. So after that, he says, but is God just only in the mind, like a unicorn or a leprechaun or something at the end of the rainbow? Or is God something that exists in the mind but also is real, like me or you, or the Eiffel Tower, or the White House, or the moon? As he sees it, God has to be a thing that exists in both the mind and in reality. Why? Because if he didn't exist in both the mind and in reality, then he wouldn't be the greatest thing you could possibly conceive of, because as he argues, it is greater to exist in both the mind and in reality rather than just the mind alone. So if it's greater to exist in both, and God's definition is greatest thing you can conceive of, then he must exist in both, for if he didn't, he'd be less great than something. The method of argument used there is the reductio ad absurdum, where you assume the contrary of what you want to prove, and then show that it leads to something that's not possible. In his case, he says, imagine God's only in the mind. But that's absurd, because if he was only in the mind, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, which is in contradiction to his definition. So he has to exist in the mind and in reality. After that, he made this point that maybe you remember it too, that not only must God exist according to the definition of God, but he also can't even be thought not to exist. Why did he say this? Because as he argues, if a being can be thought not to exist, like say me or you, or even just the whole planet Earth or anything else, if something can be thought of as capable of not existing, then that is less perfect and great than something that cannot be thought of as not existing. So God, being the greatest thing you could ever conceive of out of all things, must be not capable of being thought to not exist. So God's too great, basically, to even be thought of as not existing. So that thought can't happen. It's not possible to think that God does not exist. Because if you could think so, that would detract from how perfect and great he is, but he's the greatest, by definition. Did we talk about the thing that he said after that? That, okay, so then what's the atheist God in their mind? If they say that there's that I don't believe in God, how can they possibly think or say that? Because according to Anselm, it's not possible. Did I mention to you guys what he says about that little problem? I think I might have, that they're not thinking of the real God. They're thinking of some other concept, and they may utilize the term God or the label of God, but that's not a real, legitimate thought about the actual being, because God himself can't be thought of as non-existent. So when you think of something as not existing, you're definitely not thinking of God, no matter what you may attempt to say you're thinking about. So those are not like real thoughts about God, according to him. Atheist has the wrong thought in mind. Okay, and then after that, we studied these objections, and that was really the topic last time. So there were three major objections that we went past. First of all, the Ganilo objection. So this is a Christian monk who lived back in the day, the same time period as Anselm. What do you remember about his discussion, Ganilo? Like, who could tell me the main example that he used? He said, okay, the ontological argument, it's not really a very convincing argument, because I could just as well, give the example of a lost island. So he says, think about an island which I will describe to you as the greatest conceivable island, better than any other island you could ever imagine, having everything to the highest degree of perfection, the lost island. So he says, now that I'm talking to you about this invented or imaginary island, it's in your mind, but he then kind of uses Anselm's logic against him. He says, according to Anselm, when a thing has been defined as the greatest conceivable such and such, it must really exist, because existence is part of being that great. Therefore, it can't only exist in the mind. So then, according to Anselm, I suppose that we have to conclude that this island is real. But that's where he says, of course, we all know it's not actually real, though. So the logic used by Anselm is demonstrated to be defective, because the same type of argument can be used in an attempt to prove the existence of things that are just simply known to not exist. So although Ganilo also believes in God, he doesn't think that you can really prove the existence of something like that just by starting off with the idea, even if it's the idea of something that's greater than anything else. Okay? And then we talked about the work of G.E. Moore. Okay? What was G.E. Moore's essential point, if anyone can remind us? The main concept or idea that he puts forth in his paper. What is his dispute with Anselm? He says the wrong thing about Anselm's argument is, well, existence. Yeah, so exactly, Brooklyn and all of you guys, that it's not a predicate. Existence, he argues, is not a predicate. And that's where he thinks Anselm's argument went wrong. What's the word predicate mean again? In other words, what's the sort of basic understanding of the term predicate? When he says it's not a predicate, in other words, he's saying that it's not a what? It's not an attribute, right? It's not a quality or a feature of something. Good. Now, there's a few different ways to come around to the idea that he's got here, that existence is not an attribute, it's not a predicate. One way is just thinking about it off of common sense. If you were going to describe something, you'd talk about stuff like that exists, because it's already assumed when one discusses what a thing's attributes are, that the thing exists. If it didn't exist, there would be no thing to give attributes to. So it's kind of just mistaken to think that existence is an attribute. If I was going to tell you about myself, I would tell you I'm a professor, I love music, I'm a big runner, I like tennis, basketball, some other sports, but I would never say, plus I exist, and that's pretty cool. Existence is not really some description. But his own way of making this point relied on a linguistic comparison between two groups of sentences. So he says, think for a moment about these three sentences having to do with tigers, okay? And they were three sentences that mentioned that tigers exist, but they were divided because of the prefix before the statement that tigers exist, whether it was some, most, or all. Okay, so some tigers exist, growl. I was starting with growl. Consider these three statements about tigers growling with the prefix some, most, or all attached to the front. And his larger point is that all of those sentences make decent sense. No. Okay, I gotta put her in the other room. She's almost messed up the live stream, so she's a good kitty, but she just wants my attention too much. I'm sorry, 1 second. Maybe food. Sorry, guys. Yeah. She's just too much energy. Okay. Some tigers growl, most tigers growl, all tigers growl. Those three sentences make perfect sense. They just say different claims about how many of the tigers have the feature of growling. But when we swap out the term growl for exists, we generate these three statements. Some tigers exist, most tigers exist, all tigers exist. And when those are the new statements, they don't all make sense. Some tigers exist kind of makes sense because it just says there's at least one existing tiger. But when we get to most and all, or some do not, those lack clear meaning. What are we talking about? If we say most tigers exist, like the majority of them exist, and then there's a smaller number of them that don't exist, but there's no way to compare the numbers of things that on the one hand exist and on the other hand don't. You can compare the number of things that growl versus the number of things that do not growl, because on both sides of that difference, everything exists. But there's no way of quantifying the relative number of things that have existence versus not having existence. And he thinks that that illustrates to you and shows you that it's really logically confused to talk about existence as though it was an attribute. And that's where he finds fault with Anselm's argument, because if you go back to Anselm's argument, he said, if a being is thought of as the perfect being, the greatest being ever, that you could ever think of, then it would have to have every feature that goes into making something great. And that means that it would have to have existence, because that's one of those great things. That is one great attribute that you would have to have if you're perfect. But, Moore says, stop right there. It's not an attribute. Let's break it down, and you'll see why existence is not truly a predicate. And if it's not, it will not serve the purposes of Anselm's argument the way he thought it would. Okay, and then the last piece from last meeting, just as we're going over a review, was written by William Rowe. Okay, William Rowe, kind of a contemporary living philosopher. Well, he retired in 2005, but for the most part, leading up close to the current day. He also found fault with Anselm's argument. His article was called Why the Ontological Argument Fails. And overall, he said this: you could try to define something as existing, but that definition is not going to prove that it exists. So even if a thing is defined as existing, it might not really exist, and the definition couldn't, change that. So in his view, Anselm just defines God as existing. And then he says, well, it's right there in the definition. So if you say he doesn't exist, it's like you're denying the definition of the word, but we already know what it means. Rowe says that that's problematic. You can't just prove something exists by listing its definition and putting the word existence in the definition. To show why that does not work, he gives us this interesting example with two made-up words, magic hand and magic hoe. Okay, now if you remember, magic hand was his just stipulated word, which means existing magician. People like David Blaine. David Blaine just actually he flew over Arizona with balloons. How is that magic, though? This guy just does escape acts. This is not really magic. Anyway, okay, David Blaine, Harry Houdini, David Copperfield, Chris Angel. So those are like some living flesh and blood people who either do live or have lived that practice magic tricks. And then you've got, that might be a better description, Dewey, but I don't want to make a big deal out of it. Okay, so on the other hand, non-existing magicians, that's magic hoe. That's like Harry Potter, Gandalf, Merlin, maybe Doctor Strange, and some others. So here's the point. Like, just because we have the word magic hand and it means existing magician, that doesn't prove that there have to be such things. If there were no magicians, or if they stopped existing, we could still have that word, and it just wouldn't correspond to anything that's real in the world. So like if tomorrow, I don't know, extremists came out, like the anti-magician extremists, and just assassinated every living magician, and I taught this lesson to you next week after that, it wouldn't be like they come back because the word is still out there, right? So whether magicians exist or not cannot be determined on the basis of a word which means existing magician. So just like magic can, the word God could mean, by definition, existing being. But if this universe doesn't actually have God in it, then the word itself is not going to make that different, okay? Now, the last part of the lesson, at the very tail end, I was trying to give you this alternative example. I think we talked about it enough that I don't have to really write notes, but I said, instead of Rowe's example, think about this one. What if I make up the word unican? And unican means existing unicorn. Well, have I just now proven that unicorns exist because I invented this word right here and now? No. There are no unicorns, and whether or not I make this word up and I include within its definition existing, that has no bearing on whether there actually are such things. So in Rowe's view, Anselm is simply engaged in a very clever act of wordplay where he asserts that the definition of God includes existence within it, and then says to any critic, challenging that is like going against the definition, and that's just impossible, so he has to exist. Rowe's point is that even if a thing is defined as existing, it still might not really exist. His example is a little funny, I know, because when he says magican, there are, real life examples of such people to point to. But what he's talking about is, if counterfactually there had not been any such, then the word itself would not have made any difference to that. Maybe I can read a little passage from the book on his essay, and then we'll be able to close that and move on. So, as he says it here, so he says, here we've introduced two words, it's on page 22, magican and magico. Something of interest follows from the fact that existing is part of our definition of magican. Because while it's true that Merlin was a magician, it's not true that Merlin was a magican. And something of interest follows from our including non-existing in the definition of magico. For while it's true that Houdini was a magician, it is not true that Houdini was a magico. Houdini was a magician and a magican, but not a magico, whereas Merlin was a magician and a magico, but not a magican. But must some existing thing exemplify the concept magican? No. From the fact that existing is included in the definition of magican, it does not follow that some existing thing is a magican. All that follows is that no non-existing thing is a magican, based on the definition. If there were no magicians in existence, and here's the key passage, if there were, contrary to fact, no magicians in existence, then there would be nothing to which the term magican would apply. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from our definition of magican that some existing thing is a magican. Only if magicians exist will it be true that some existing thing is a magican. And we're now in a position to help our friends see, from the mere fact that God is defined as existing, it does not follow that some existing being is God. Whether some existing thing is God will depend on whether there is some perfect being. But if no such being exists, then there would be nothing to which the term would refer. This being so, it does not follow merely from the definition of the word God that some existing thing is God. Only if such being exists will it be true that God, as our friend conceives of him, exists. Okay, so my little recap and summary of the previous. Any questions on those things for now? If so, just at any time, feel free to chime in and ask anything that might be on your mind. But otherwise, I'm going to go on, and we're going to talk about some new arguments now for the existence of God. I think we've talked about the ontological argument in good detail. So we got a couple more. Hello there, Ronald, and to anybody else here in the meeting. Appreciate you guys' attendance for sure. Okay, so there's more than one argument for God's existence, going through history and looking at some of the best that have ever been written. The next one that we're going to talk about, in my mind anyway, is one of the highest quality, perhaps the best of all. That's just my view, but you'll hear about it and see what you think. So just getting my notes open to that particular article. Okay, so now we're going to learn about what is called the Cosmological Argument. We're reading an article by this philosopher, Richard Taylor. Opening my book really fast. I just want to give you the dates of his lifetime and some other basic information. So, yeah, Richard Taylor, he lived from 1919 till 2003. Okay, and he wrote this book, Metaphysics, that was originally published in 1993, and then a reprinted version came out in 92. I said 63, right? I hope I did. But anyway, 1963 is the original publication date of this article that we're going to look at, which is just called the Cosmological Argument. So this is the second of our big three, as it were, arguments for God's existence. We covered ontological argument and three criticisms. And now we're on to the cosmological argument. So Richard Taylor, the American philosopher of the 20th century, he talked about this argument in 1963, and that's the source from our textbook that we're reading. But I just want to clarify one thing. It's just a minor point. This argument is actually ancient. It stretches back thousands of years. You'll find versions of this argument written by ancient Greek philosophers hundreds of years before the Christian era. You'll see it in world cultures and other traditions also, stretching back even further. So it's actually a deeply rooted argument in world history and in the history of ideas. Taylor's not the original creator of the argument, but he discusses it and tries to present it in his own time. We're reading Taylor's version of it since it's from our book, but I'm just telling you it has a really rich history, and he's not the first who ever thought about it. Okay, so let's learn, if we can, about this cosmological argument by Richard Taylor. Now, to begin his discussion, he starts off with the presentation of a hypothetical scenario, a thought experiment, if you will. That's a hallmark, that's a trademark feature of philosophy, to ask the reader to engage with imagined situations in order to fix your mind on a specific concept. So here we have a hypothetical scenario to look at and consider, and I want you to think about it as though it was really happening to you. So pretend or suppose that you were walking around in like the woods, some type of natural forest-like area. So here's you. There you are, and you're walking, and so you're in the woods basically. And in the woods, you see all kinds of normal wood stuff like trees, bushes, maybe little woodland creatures scampering around. Okay, little streams, rocks, grass, soil. You understand, just normal stuff. But then there's this one thing that you came across on your walk, which was out of the ordinary and kind of weird. So what you came and saw as you're walking in the woods was a big sphere. Okay? And just to demonstrate that this is a sphere, I'll show you the light glints from the sphere off of its curved surface. Okay? And this is a three-dimensional human being like you and me, even though it looks like a stick figure. Will you be tested on the dates? No, but it's a lot of dignity and pride in knowing those dates. Okay? So anyway, I'm not going to ask you questions like, tell me the date. I'm going to ask you only questions about the topics. But, it's scholarly and academic when you say, here's the author and the dates they had. But it's not something that I would grade because it's not about memorization of dates, this kind of class. It's about the arguments themselves. But I would like you to know them just for your own sake. But I'll never grade you on that. Okay? Okay. Now, this person, you, are in the woods, and you see this sphere. Now, probably if you saw something that much out of the ordinary in the woods, it's a big translucent sphere. So like you could see through it, light can shine through it. It's kind of maybe, who knows the material, maybe it's glass, maybe it's plastic, but it's a large translucent sphere, maybe about the height of your body. It's the only thing in the woods that as you walk through it is out of the ordinary and misplaced. So what do you think would be a normal reaction for any of us to have if they did see like something like that on their little walk in the woods? Like what would be a normal kind of thought process that might then happen? Sophia, you're saying you'd run? I mean, yeah, maybe you'd run. But I wasn't really, why though? Because what you're seeing is something unusual, right? And then Dewey, you say, what is that? Red, you're also going with run and thinking of it as a threat. Well, I'm not talking about the action, perhaps, but the mental thoughts. Like confusion, okay. Fear, I'm surprised how many are reporting on fear. It's just a sphere. What's it going to do? Kill you? It's just made out of glass or something. What do you think? There's aliens or whatever? This is a real life. I'm asking you to imagine this scenario. So like in your real life, I don't think you'd be like freaked out, right? Maybe in a movie you'd think the character should be worried because next thing that's going to happen is a bad guy's going to pop out. But I'm talking about like a hypothetical that you might actually experience. So, you probably think it was debris or trash or something that some weird person put behind. And right, so kind of what I'm fishing for is something that you're already all saying in your own different ways, which is that it's weird, right? That it's confusing and strange, and it's not normal to see something like that there. So it would trigger your natural feelings of curiosity and inquisitiveness. Even if you're not going to like investigate it, perhaps, I'm sure that for at least a split second, your mind would be like, hey, that's strange. I wonder how that got there. You know, what's that doing there? I wouldn't have expected to see anything like that, right? So any human being would have to stop and pause for at least a split second to question, well, why is that there? That's kind of strange. Now, it would be an odd, I think, sort of person who could just walk past something like that and have no reaction. Like, oh, sphere in the woods, okay, normal, just moving on, don't care. So the point being, in this example, it triggers curiosity. It triggers questions like, what's it doing there, and how did it, arrive in the forest? Okay, so he says typically any person would probably find that odd, and they would ask questions like how to get there and why does it exist. Now, what makes you ask those questions about how did it get there, why is it there? It's because it's out of place, right? It's because it's something that's unusual to see in that setting. Now, if you were like in an art museum or something, like a modern art museum, and you saw the same thing, like in one of the galleries, you probably wouldn't be like, whoa, I'm freaked out, this is confusing, like what's that doing there? Because in a modern art gallery, like something like that would typically perhaps be seen. And so that's an ordinary place to see something like that. In a natural wooded setting, it's unusual. So he points that out, that it is only our familiarity or lack of familiarity with seeing an object in a particular place that leads us to these questions of curiosity, right? When you see something in its everyday normal place, those type of questions don't really strike us in the same way, right? So like, I don't know where you're at right now. When we were all in class, it's easier to be like, so see these desks? Those are normal things to see in a classroom. I'll have to change up the example then. So like, you're probably most of you at home, right? And if you are, then like say in your kitchen, you got a fridge. I'm sure that when you walk up to the fridge in your own house, or whatever, there's this monitor. I know that you're all looking at the monitor. That could be another fair example. So when you like pick up your device to watch this lecture, right, wherever the device is at, you probably don't look at it and you're like, where did it come from? How did this device come here? How did this device like originate, right? It's probably that's a sort of thought that you would not be stimulated to have because you're used to seeing this computer or phone, whatever you're watching this on, in your room or where you typically play. So when you see things in their ordinary, accustomed place, you don't have the same type of inquisitive and curious response. But now here's the point he wants to make. Could you, if you really wanted to, is it at least possible to ask those types of questions? How did it get here? What is its origin? Is it possible to ask those questions about things that are in their ordinary place? Like when you go to the kitchen, you see the fridge, could you think and ask in your mind, I wonder where the fridge started its existence off. I wonder what the, origin story is of the fridge and how it arrived ultimately to my kitchen. Could you ask the same thing about this device that you're watching this on? You know where you bought it from, I guess, or how you acquired it. But could you like think going down the rabbit hole? I wonder what its ultimate origins are. Like what factory did it come out of? How did it get started, right? So could you ask questions about the origin and the existence of even everyday normal things? Yes, basically Red Panda and Cameron, you could ask those questions, but we don't typically because there's nothing to trigger our curiosity when the thing's in an average place. But those questions can still be asked, and they do have to have answers, right? So even if this device that you're watching this on, you don't know what its ultimate origin is, don't you agree that it has to have an origin, though, even if it's not known or understood by you right now? You'd have to agree with that, right? That like this computer clearly came from somewhere, and it clearly has a beginning, middle, and end, even if you don't know what those beginnings are. Understand me? Okay, good. So this sphere thing is just like a little example that he is using to tease this idea out of you. he starts with something weird because he knows that the reaction of seeing something weird and out of place is, how did that get there? That's strange. I'm curious. And he knows that the reaction you have to seeing ordinary things like this book on my table or anything else is typically just no reaction because it's supposed to be there. But then he just reminds us that although it is odd or perhaps unconventional, you could ask those questions about even ordinary things. And by the way, those questions do have like objective answers, even if we don't possess those answers. Now, the things that we can ask origin questions about, like how did it get here? Where did it start from? Those questions can be asked about everything. They can be asked about everything, even you and me. I mean, my origins and your origins come from the conception of us by our parents back in whenever year. And going back and back and back, it seems like everything has the same kind of basic feature, that there's some origin to it if we went back far enough in time. Okay? So whether it was this weird example that he chooses of a sphere in the woods, or just ordinary example of anything else, now that he's got your mind focused on the larger topic, that we can ask these questions. How did it start? Where did it come from? We can ask those questions not merely about the one given example, but about everything. Okay, so now I'm going to read a little bit from the book so you can kind of see what he meant or said. So he says here, suppose you were strolling around in the woods, and in addition to the stick stones and other, usual litter of the forest floor, you one day came upon some quite unusual object, something not quite like what you had ever seen before and would never expect to find there. Suppose, for example, that it is a large ball about your own height, perfectly smooth and translucent. You would deem this puzzling and mysterious, certainly, but if you think about it, it's no more mysterious than that such a thing should exist than that anything else should exist. If you were quite used to finding these objects around you most of the time, but had never seen an ordinary rock, then finding a large rock in the woods would be just as puzzling to you. And this illustrates the fact that something that is mysterious ceases to seem mysterious simply by being used to its presence. It is strange indeed that our world exists, yet very few people are struck by the strangeness and simply take it for granted. Okay? Now, continuing then with the example of this sphere. He says, in this hypothetical circumstance or situation, you would never say of the sphere that maybe it has no origins at all. Maybe it just came from nothing. Maybe it just popped out of the void and it's just got no origins. He says that is clearly something that you'd have to be like insane to think, right? Even if you don't know anything about where it came from, you know that it can't come from nothing at all. You know that it can't just come from thin air and just have no origins, right? So he says, nobody who's sane and reasonable would ever say of the sphere that it has no origins, okay? That's what he says. Whatever else you might wonder about it, there's one thing that you would never question, that it did not appear there all by itself, that it owes its existence to something else. You might not have the remotest idea how it got there, but you know there must be some explanation. The idea that it had come from nothing at all is one that very few people would consider worthy of taking seriously. So, as strange as it is, and as mysterious as it might be where it came from, it came from somewhere, basically, and it can't just come from itself or from nothing, right? Okay, now, this illustrates a very important principle to his argument. And so the whole point of this leading example in the first part of the essay is to illustrate this principle that I'm going to put on the board now. Okay, and it's called the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so what it says is this. Principle of sufficient reason. It's stated as follows. This is the way he puts it. In the case of any positive truth, there is some sufficient reason or explanation for it. In other words, that's his way of putting it. And I would like to phrase it also in a second way that's perhaps a little more just straightforward. You can also just say it as follows, that there is some cause or explanation for everything. So every event has a cause. Okay? So there we have the principle of sufficient reason. It just is saying, again, I'll read it again, that in the case of any positive truth, so whenever something is true, there has to be some reason that it happened. In other words, every event has a cause. Nothing happens without a cause. Nothing happens without some kind of reason or explanation that gave rise to it. What does positive truth mean? Let me explain that. A positive truth is that something does exist. A negative truth would be that something does not exist. Now, negative truths, the principle of sufficient reason doesn't really apply to them. So like look around you in your room right now. I'm sure there's no, let's say, rhinoceros in your room. The fact that there's no rhinoceros there is a negative truth because one doesn't exist in your room. But the non-existence of the rhino, let's say in your room, doesn't have to have a cause because it's not something that exists. But if there is something that does positively exist in your room, whether it's this device or your textbook or, I don't know, a pair of shoes or whatever, if it does exist, then it has to have a backstory and an origin. But something that does not exist, that doesn't apply. Hopefully, because that makes sense. So when something exists, clearly it had a cause that got it started. Like me and you, we exist, and something had to get us started. We didn't cause ourselves to exist or, give rise to ourselves. Okay? That's all the principle says. So the sphere is supposed to basically articulate this through an example. If you saw the sphere, your mind would think about the principle of sufficient reason, at least briefly. You'd look at it and you'd scratch your head and be like, strange. That's not supposed to be in the forest. I wonder how it got there because, by the way, everything has some kind of cause. Even if I don't know what it is, I know that there is some cause and some reason for its existence. Okay? And of course, then he substitutes the sphere for just anything in general that positively exists. It doesn't need to be this weirdo example of like a sphere in the woods. It could just be any ordinary thing. And the principle of sufficient reason applies across the board to any positive truth. Okay? So he hopes the reader will be able to find agreement with this. The principle of sufficient reason, he thinks, is just deeply rooted in our common sense logic. If something exists, it's own, it's caused by something that somehow precedes it. Okay? So now, what we're going to do next is I need to talk to you guys about two types of truths. Okay, so to advance this argument to the next stage, we're going to clear the board and we're going to quickly talk about two types of truth. All right? And at any point, as usual, you can let me know if you want something to be clarified or repeated or just questioned. Okay, two types of truth. We're still talking about the cosmological argument here by Richard Taylor. Okay, so two types of truth. First of all, there are what we call contingent truths. And then on the other hand, there's what are known as necessary truths. Okay, so let's talk about the contingent ones first. Contingent truths are things that are true, but they didn't need to be. They could have been false if things had gone differently. Okay, so you got to think about facts, but that were matters of chance or probability, that they could have at least, within possibility, not happened. Okay, so these are things that are true, but that could have been false. Could have been false in different circumstances, if circumstances had been different. Okay, so If it's not so easy to read, maybe I write that one time in the chat. Okay. So let's see if you can come up with some examples then of some contingent truths. And basically the contingent truths, they should be easy examples to come up with because it's pretty much just any event at all that has ever happened that could have turned out differently. Okay, so like just think about the world, and if you just start listing pretty much any fact about it, it's going to be a contingent truth. So what are you thinking like some contingent truths? Just hit me with some like, these are facts. These got to be true things, but they might not have happened in a different case. World War II, coronavirus, okay, great examples already. Let me just go over some of them. World War II, the rise of Nazi Germany and the Allies going against the Axis powers to defeat them and restore order. That would be something that happened, but you know what? If Hitler had not risen to power, maybe World War II wouldn't have happened. So it happened, of course, and we know that, but it didn't need to happen. In historical terms, it could have played out differently. Coronavirus, good example there, Ronald. You know, the virus, I guess, somehow has to do with animal to human transmission, and then it obviously has become very widespread. But maybe, you know, if the particular interaction with the animal that got it started had never happened, or maybe if very strict controls had been applied once a small outbreak happened and you never saw it spread, maybe then we wouldn't have a global pandemic. What I had to eat, good. I had bagels earlier today. They're very good. There's a place like close by to where I live that has really good examples of good bagels, but you know, I might have chosen something else. I have stuff in my fridge. If I had wanted to be a little lazier, I could have just heated up a TV dinner. So I had the bagels, but I didn't need to. World War I, another good example. I think it originally started by the assassination of Archduke Franz Joseph of Austria. Anyway, those events, they could have played out differently. Maybe the shot would have missed. He hadn't been assassinated. Maybe there wouldn't have been all of the consequences that resulted from it. Let's see. Dodgers winning World Series, yeah. You walking your dog, the Holocaust, 9/11. All these things that we are referring to are good examples of contingent truths. How about you? Your existence, is that contingent? I mean, isn't it true that you exist? It is true. But that's contingent as well, because your parents, it was a chance meeting, wasn't it? Maybe if they had never met, then you wouldn't be watching this lecture right now. So contingent truths, hopefully it's kind of sinking in. They're things that are true, but that could have potentially, in hypothetical different circumstances, not happened. Okay, now necessary truths. Necessary truths are things that are true, but unlike the contingent truths, they could not possibly be false. So they are necessarily true instead of just true due to circumstance. Okay, so things that are true that could not possibly be false. Could not possibly be false, and they are true. Okay, now the necessary truths, I always find that the first sort of attempt at, you know, giving some examples of them is a little weird because you got to really think outside the box a little bit. But let's see if anyone has some thoughts about it. There's a couple of possible types that are easy to give. Dying, well, you know, actually, you'd think that it's necessarily a true thing that a human being has to die, but in theory, you could just continue to age if there was a way of supporting the biological functions of your brain beyond its normal lifespan. Like suppose that we could somehow integrate your brain to a computer system and allow it to therefore continue functioning. I mean, so I'm just giving you weird possibilities, but dying though, it happened 100% of the time with everybody. I guess it's theoretically possible to escape death, but it has not happened yet. So even further outside the box than that, Raphael. Now, I like the example here, Ashton. 1 + 1 = 2. Good example. 1 plus 1 equals 2 is a mathematical necessary truth. It's not like predicting the weather or something. If it's predicted tomorrow to be rainy or sunny, that's something that's probability based. And we understand that although the probability is high, that sometimes the forecast can be wrong. 1 plus 1 is 2 is not like a matter of chance or probabilities. It's just a logical necessity based on the numerals and the mathematical operation that's used. So examples of mathematical true statements are all necessary truths. 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. Sierra, you're saying H2O makes water. I would assume so. I've heard people say that if the early behavior of the universe, when it was in its early expansion phase, had expanded at a slightly different rate than the exact figure that we have, that there could have been radically different properties of the elements that we take for granted in our periodic table. But at any rate, yes, only on a very, very, very unlikely possible scenario could that have been different, but I would grant you that. Gravity is sort of the same thing. Whether gravity has the type of force that it has also has to do with early events in the inflationary period after the Big Bang. But this takes us too far, I think, into physics. So I like examples from math and geometry a lot of times. How many sides are there on a square? There's 4. And that's not something that's just a matter of chance or probability. Sometimes it's 4, but it's possible that it has 3 or 5 or something else. No. How about all the points lying on the perimeter of a circle are equidistant from the midpoint where the radius is? That's just a geometric truth that's guaranteed by the nature of that abstract object of the geometric circle. Okay, so what I'm just basically giving you examples of are necessary truths. They're not things that are matters of chance. They're not contingencies because they couldn't be different than the way they are. The triangle has 3 sides, yes. Did I say that? I mean, the rectangle and the square have 4. The triangle has 3. Having 3 sides on a triangle is a necessary truth. Okay, now that we have learned about these 2 different types of truths, yes, that 2 is a prime number or 11 or any other example like that is also good. Okay, so next up, we're going to go back to the principle of sufficient reason for a minute. What I want to tell you about the contingent truths in particular is this. Those contingent truths are things that, as we know now, are true but didn't have to be. And since they did not have to be, then there had to be something which explained that they did happen instead of not. So the principle of reason doesn't apply to them so much. But the principle of sufficient reason does directly apply to all the contingent truths. Because once again, being contingent, there had to be something that caused them, since they didn't actually need to have happened logically. Okay, so point now to understand, put these 2 things together. The principle of sufficient reason and contingent truths. The principle of sufficient reason, which was illustrated via the spirit example, shows us that whenever something is true, it must have a cause, an explanation. Positive truths, things that exist, are generally contingent truths. So if something is true and it's a contingent truth, the principle of sufficient reason kicks in and says that type of truth had to have some ultimate origin or explanation or cause. Okay, so now we are pointed to this fact. This is the truth. It's a very big, very basic truth, something that we often just don't think about, but it's very obvious, and it's this fact. The universe exists. See this statement here? Now, I hope we can agree that's true. If you feel like that's not true, we're definitely going to have a hard time going farther, because, I mean, I don't even know, how could the universe not exist? I mean, where are you at? Obviously, you are a thing that exists, and you're within the universe. So to deny that it exists would be almost like incoherent. So I think we're all on the same page here, at least this much. The universe exists. Question, which of the 2 kinds of truth is that? Is it contingent or necessary that the universe exists? Is it something that, could have been false? What is it? The universe is existing. Certainly it's true. But is it necessary or contingent? It's only one of the 2, Brianna, so you got to choose based on thinking about it. Rachel says necessary. Nisha says contingent. AJ necessary. Haley contingent. Ronald contingent. I'm looking at the distribution of opinion. Well, it seems like contingent is winning out, and that's the right answer. So I'm just going to, spoiler alert, it's that it's contingent, yes. The universe exists, but it seems as though the universe might not have existed. That's something that I believe is agreed to by pretty much all. Because if you are secular, like you believe in science over religion and stuff, then you, for the most part, would argue that there's the Big Bang. But the Big Bang is something that, you know, it has a date and time. The universe, according to the Big Bang, doesn't go back in time forever, but it's like 15 billion years old. So according to that hypothesis, if the Big Bang didn't happen, there wouldn't be a universe. Take the theistic hypothesis, the belief in God. According to that belief, the universe is not something that exists on its own, but it's because God created it. And if God had chosen not to create it, then it might not have existed. So whether you're theological or more of an atheist, everyone seems to agree that the universe has a starting point. And if it had a starting point, then whatever caused that thing to start is also something that did not need to have happened. Either the Big Bang didn't need to have happened, or God's will didn't need to have chosen to make a universe. That's one way of thinking about the claim that the universe itself is contingent. But it's also something that you can come to believe based on this thought. Every single part of the universe is contingent. Me, you, this planet, this solar system, this galaxy, and as we telescope out further and further, it seems like all the objects in the entire universe don't exist from their own. They come into being because they're caused by something that precedes them. So if all the parts of the universe appear to be contingent, then wouldn't the totality of the universe be contingent as well? It seems kind of, in a way, inconsistent to assume that all the particulars of the universe are contingent, but that the whole thing is not. So anyway, the author has just now tried to make the case that the existence of the universe is a contingent truth. Okay, this universe that we are in exists, but it didn't need to. So, going back to our principle of sufficient reason, what does it say? It says that if there's a positive truth, if there's a contingent truth, there has to be what for it? The fact that this universe exists is true, and the principle of sufficient reason can be applied to that fact. Therefore, we would have to make the assumption or conclusion that this universe, just as much as every contingent truth, has to have a what? Like the sphere example, it's got to have a cause, an origin, an explanation, exactly. You and I are contingent truths, so we have parents, and so they have parents, and so back and back. Everything has something that brought it into being. And if this universe is a contingent truth, just like all the other cases I've mentioned, then it also has to have something that caused it itself, okay? So if you're following me, all I've said is that the principle of sufficient reason was articulated on the basis of the example of the sphere. Then we moved to this discussion of how there are these two kinds of truths, contingent and necessary. It was noted that the contingent truths are things that could have been false, unlike the necessary truths. It was then noted that because the contingent truths did not need to happen, then they are the sort of facts that the principle of sufficient reason applies to, namely that they must have a cause. Okay, the universe exists, and it is argued to be contingent. Therefore, the principle of sufficient reason says it has a cause. So now the next step of the argument, and we're getting closer to the end of it, is to ask a very deep question. What could possibly be the cause of the whole universe? We're not talking about the cause of just one thing in the universe. Like, what's the cause of you, your parents? Easy enough to answer that. But we're asking a bigger question. What is the cause of everything? What is the cause of the whole system of the universe, and not just like specific things inside of it? That's a deep question, but according to the author, there's only one possible answer. Spoiler alert, it's going to be God, but let me try and get you through the steps to see that, okay? So just look at that. I'm going to draw a little diagram here. So suppose this is our universe, right? Just represented on the board as this big sphere with the letter U in it for universe. Okay, so what could be the cause of this thing? Everything that exists is in here. Me, you, somewhere we're in there, okay? Sun, Milky Way galaxy, everything else is all somewhere in there, because that's the whole universe, nothing outside of it. Okay, so First question is this. Could the universe cause itself to exist? Is that possible? Let's think it through. Could the universe be its own cause? Is that a possibility? AJ, you're pretty quick to say yes, and same with you, Red Panda, but think about what you're saying, though. Cameron, you're saying yes, too. Some are saying no. Well, the answer that the author suggests, and the one that I'm going to try and explain to you, is the no answer. The universe could not cause itself to exist. Now, for those saying no, think it through for a minute and tell me why it seems like no is the right answer. That no, it can't cause itself to exist. How come? Instead of just the answer no, let's give a little discussion. Why would it be fair to say that no, of course, it can't cause itself to exist? Why does that seem like not possible? Because something has to have an origin, yes, but why can't it be its own origin? Because exactly, Andrea, something can't create itself. A thing cannot cause itself to exist. Think about the logic of that idea. If a thing causes itself to exist, then it already exists before it causes itself. It makes no sense. Like, think about this almost weird, bizarre thought. Can a person give birth to themselves? Can a person create themselves? No, of course not. I mean, the thing that is the cause has to exist before the effect. So it's not like the universe can cause itself, because then it would have to already have existed in order to bring itself into being, which makes no sense. Then it exists before itself. So nothing inside the universe can somehow be the cause of the universe, because the universe itself is the effect. And anything that's a part of it is a part of that which we're trying to explain. So it can't be the thing that is the source of itself, right? Well, we're going to go down that rabbit hole, AJ, but I'm taking it slow. So the first point right now is to understand, at least as he would argue, that a contingent thing cannot be its own cause. That's just illogical, because a thing has to already pre-exist in order to be the cause of anything. And so if the universe caused itself, then it wouldn't have needed to do so, because it was already in existence in order to be capable of causing itself. Okay, now here's the next question to ask, okay? So like this picture that I just drew is not possible, because it's like the cause is coming from the thing that is itself the result, and that's not possible. The universe is that which is the consequence of whatever has caused it, but it can't be both the cause and the effect. So here's another possible question. Could this universe be caused by something? So whatever's something that's separate from it, distinct from it, because anything that's a part of it is internal to the system that we're trying to explain. So could it be that the universe is caused by something that is contingent? Now, I just labeled this with the letter C to stand for some contingent being that causes the universe. That's a new question. So do you think that some contingent thing could be the cause of the whole universe? Something that is itself contingent. Could a contingent being be the cause of our universe? Not the universe itself, but some separate thing that's contingent. Is that possible? So something itself that is a contingent being. Could a contingent thing cause this universe? Andrea is saying possibly. Raphael thinks so. Okay. Rachel, yes. AJ, yes, but. Okay, the overwhelming initial intuition of many is yes. Ricardo saying no, and you know what? Actually, as the author will argue, it's another no answer. Okay, so Andrea, I understand your point here. You're thinking, okay, so like suppose there's, but you say maybe like a dying star colliding and atoms or whatever created our universe. But wouldn't that happen within a universe, Andrea? So if that event is itself something that's happening within some type of physical space, then that can't be the first event, because that thing itself would require some type of cause, right? Exactly, AJ. What would have created that star and those atoms? So like if you think, for example, okay, our universe is something that was created by a being in a different universe within the multiverse. And so relative to our universe, that thing's the creator. But if that creator is contingent, you see, then that would also have to have what? Based on the principle of sufficient reason. If our universe is caused by something else that is contingent, then the cause of the universe would also have to have a what? Cause, exactly. And then that would seem to go back and back and back to infinity if there's never something that's a necessary being that starts it all off, right? So if the cause of the universe was something contingent, then that being would have to have a cause. And so if it's contingent all the way back, then this goes on and on to infinity. And according to the author, that is not possible. Because in that case, there's no origin at all to the whole sequence. There can't be a sequence that doesn't have a beginning. So if we just sort of kick the can back a step to the next contingent cause, to the next, to the next, to the next, it's got to ultimately end somewhere. Okay, so what he then ultimately says is the only possible starting point for all these causes that leads to the origins of our universe, the only possible starting point has to be something that's not contingent. So instead, it has to be what? The ultimate origin and cause of the universe can't be something that depends on anything else. It can't be something that is contingent, therefore it has to be necessary, right? So the only possible cause of the universe is a necessary being, God. So whatever causes this universe can't be something that depends on anything else. Because if that was the case, then it wouldn't be the first cause. And then we would still be scratching our heads wondering, well, what caused that thing that is itself contingent? So if there's got to be something that starts everything, if the universe can't be its own starting point, and if whatever causes it ultimately can't be contingent, then when we go back through the series of causes, the initial origin of all has to be something that can found the sequence. But a contingent being can never be the foundation, because a contingent being depends on something else to bring it in, okay? So wherever the chain of causes ends, going way, way, way back to the original origins, it's going to have to end with something that is necessary rather than contingent. And what he's arguing is just that God is the necessary being. So God as the necessary being, which causes the contingent universe, is the only picture that can make sense of our universe according to him. Otherwise, we would be left with the possible idea that he thinks makes no sense, that the universe has no origin, or that the universe just causes itself to exist, or that the universe is the result of an infinite regress. But, another point to make clear, an infinite regress is impossible. That's what he says before making this conclusion. So there he rests his case, and maybe I can read a little from the words of the author, and so you can see how he put it. Okay, so he says, from the principle of sufficient, this is on page 26, from the principle of sufficient reason, it follows that there must be a reason not only for the existence of everything in the world, but for the whole world itself, meaning by the world, the whole universe, except God. The principle does not imply that there must be some purpose or goal for everything. All the principle requires is that there be some sort of cause or reason for everything. It would be odd to maintain that everything in the world owes its existence to something, and then to deny this of the whole universe itself. So he says, think of the ball that you see in the forest in the original example. You could hardly doubt that there must be an explanation for the existence of that, even though you may not know what the explanation is. So continuing on a little further, God, he says, if we think of God as the creator of heaven and earth, and if we consider heaven and earth to include everything that exists except for God, then we appear to have fairly strong reasons for asserting that God exists. There is nothing in the world, this is on page 29 now, there's nothing in the world concerning which it is at all plausible to suppose that it exists by its own nature or contains within itself for the reason of its within itself the reason for its existence. In fact, everything in the universe appears to be the opposite, something that not only didn't need to exist, but at some time or another in the past or in the future or both, did not in fact exist. Like think about you, for example. You haven't always existed. I mean, you've existed probably for 18, 21 something years. And if you go back like 100 years, you weren't even on the scene. And in 100 years from now, I guess maybe you won't be on the scene then. So like we are things that exist temporarily. So something has to get us started. And the universe would appear to be just a larger example of a being like us, of course, much larger and more extensive through time, but something that just as much as me and you has to have some cause that gets it going. That's what he's saying here. So everything in the world seems to have a finite span, whether long or short. Most things, like ourselves, exist only for a short time. They come into being and then they cease. Other things, like planets and stars, last longer, but they still perish eventually. We arrive at the conclusion then that although the universe may contain some things that have existed a long time, it's nevertheless doubtful that it contains anything that has been there forever, and everything in the world is capable of perishing, however long it may have already existed. So, he says it's not plausible that the universe is necessary being because whatever is in the world exists contingently. It would seem then that the world is contingent and therefore dependent upon something other than itself for its existence, if it depends on anything at all. And it must depend on something, otherwise there would be no reason that it exists in the first place. He says we could say one of two things. Either the world depends for its existence upon something else, which depends on something else to infinity. That would be like an infinite sequence of contingent causes. Or that the world derives its existence from something that exists through its own nature and that is eternal, imperishable, and necessary, the creator of heaven and earth. The first option is impossible because it doesn't really give a reason that the whole sequence exists in the first place. It just says there's an infinite sequence. The second answer then is the only one that can give order and structure to our concept of how this universe gets started. Yeah, so God is the necessary being upon which everything else depends. God, though, is independent. So the idea of God is that unlike everything that is contingent, he is a necessary being, which does not depend on anything for his existence. Everything other than God is contingent and depends on something else. Your existence depended on the meeting of your parents and the conception of you. Likewise for them. And, you know, if it's something that's not a biological organism, existence on the accumulated gases in the void of space based on laws of physics. But nothing in the whole universe, whether it's small, large, or in between, can exist on its own without a prior cause. So he just applies the same reasoning there to the whole universe itself, not merely the items within it. And he's arguing that if you think about the concept of cause and effect, a thing cannot be its own cause. And if you instead say that there's an infinite sequence of causes, so there's no origin in this like chain of causation, that is also mind-boggling and absurd. How could there be a sequence of events that doesn't have an origin? So since there must be some starting point, it's going to have to start with something that's not contingent like everything else. It will have to start with something that is the foundation of all else from which everything else flows. So God then is this necessary being. Now, notice that in his argument, he doesn't give more detailed, account of what God is like or which religion it is. He just says the universe has to depend on something for its existence, and clearly it does exist. So whatever is the cause is some type of necessary being that transcends the universe and that is over and beyond and above it. But that doesn't mean that he's like saying, for example, oh, and it's the Christian religion or it's Islam or it's Judaism. It's just there's a divine being that's a necessary being. And then it's left to the individual to, I guess, practice a religious, tradition that supplies, I guess, some more substantial detail about what God is claimed to be like and what his desires and wishes are with respect to mankind. So, right, it's not like he's writing from the perspective of this or that type of theologian, just the generic concept that there must be a necessary being, and that is compatible with the doctrines of any particular revealed religion that people practice. Okay, now I could probably say a little more on this, and there's one more argument for God's existence that I did not get to cover today, but it's a little bit more brief and easier, I think, to just run through. So when we're back on Tuesday, I'll talk to you guys about the argument from design, and then we'll go on and state perhaps what are some objections to this argument and to the argument from design. In my mind, this is like perhaps, I don't know, I find it to be the most interesting and compelling argument for God's existence, that if I was out there trying to convince a skeptic of God's existence, I might rely on this. You'd go through the reasons and say, well, how do you think the universe exists? Clearly, can't support its own existence. Even scientists say that the Big Bang is the cause of the universe. But if there's something that caused the universe, it has to be something that's different from it. And unless we just say that there's an infinite sequence of causes, it has to be something that is different in kind from contingent beings. So I like this argument because it relies only on intuitions about cause and effect, which I think everybody shares, whether you're theological or more secular. But there are also objections that can be fairly put to it. The basic objections are like, well, if everything has to have a cause, then what is God? Then how is God, coherent? Because if everything has to have a cause, wouldn't God have to have one too? And then some will say, well, if God does not have to have a cause, then how come the universe can't just be the necessary being itself? Suppose that the universe is like, the infinite necessary being and does not even have an origin. So some people would deny that the universe has origins. The steady state model of the universe, which used to prevail before Hubble's telescope showed that there's evidence for the Big Bang, that was actually the dominant view in physics for a long time. So there's ways to try and object to the argument. Some would also say, is the principle of sufficient reason true? Does everything have to have a cause? Maybe there are things that don't have causes, like maybe the universe is one of those things. So there's ways of objecting, but we're just trying to master the arguments and learn the ins and outs of both sides. So, go back, look at the text again if you hadn't had a chance. Sometimes these lectures can clarify the readings that make it then easier to reread or to just scan it one more time. So I invite you to do that to just kind of reinforce your knowledge of the lesson. But I think we've come to the end today. So I appreciate all you guys' time and attention, as always. Try to make sure you just keep coming to class, twice a week, 5:30 to 6:45. So we have our long holiday weekend. Some of you, if you have Monday, Wednesday classes, you got Labor Day off, so enjoy that. Any questions anyone's got right now? I figure not a lot of time, but you can let me know if there's anything big. If not, I'll see you guys next time and have a good weekend. And you can also let me know via email any other additional questions that you might have. Okay, guys, I'm going to distribute the first essay prompts next week, so not to worry yet. I want to make sure I cover all the religious topics first because the first essay is on that. So we'll talk about it next week. But for now, take it easy. Good luck with all your other classes, okay? And I'll see you guys back then next time. All right, take care. Thank you. Thanks.